Condoms off.
There was a time in my life as a rock and roll disc jockey, I was playing your songs every third song. You might have been the biggest band in the world at one point, am I correct?
Why can't a rock group sell records to an Elton John fan or a Michael Jackson fan or whatever without losing your original market? It's just good rock music that we'd like to appeal to everybody.
The mountains of Holland, as Joe said.
Probably the best audience of this tour. And I got this Led Zeppelin t-shirt at Taz Records, yeah.
Fantastic.
It's a little local record store, so that means I'm local.
Bolan and just the hair and the image, and it was, you know, he really was, in my eyes, the grandfather of the glam rock movement.
If Mutt's listening, I'm sorry for giving you a mouthful.
I was actually born 5 minutes walk from here.
I've got a theory.
Yeah.
Just give half of what you have to somebody you don't like.
Sort of consigned to the great hat graveyard in the sky about once every 5 years.
Very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Richard Strange, lead vocalist, band leader, prolific songwriter for the Doctors of Madness, one of the greatest punk rock bands that has ever existed or ever will exist. Richard,
how kind you are, Clinton. Thank you very much. That's a lovely welcome. A lot to live up to there, though, now.
Hey, you're a son of survival. That's what you are.
That's for sure. Look at me.
And pun intended. So, Richard, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with your origin story. So why don't you tell me just and the audience just a little bit of where you grew up and what age you were when you first discovered music and you decided that, you know, that this was something that you really loved.
Sure. I was born in 1951. I'm 70 years old now. I can hardly believe I'm saying those words, but it comes to us all if we're lucky enough. And it comes to, well, those 27-year-olds who would maybe like to be here now. I grew up in a house that didn't much care for music. We lived in London. We lived in South London. It was a sort of lower middle class, upper working class, if you get that sort of weird cusp. My father was conventional to the point of insanity. He mistrusted everything that he didn't know. Growing up in the 50s, as you can imagine, we were the first generation of real teenagers. Before us, everyone was born 40 years old. And they were born with a job, you know.
Yeah.
But I had two older brothers. So my eldest brother, John, sort of brought rock and roll into the house. He discovered Elvis Presley and Little Richard and Fats Domino and all these great American artists who kicked down the doors, if you like, of bringing music specifically for teenagers to the world. So I had that as a backdrop. So by the time it was the 1960s, early 1960s, I was aware of the great music that was coming out of the UK. So my bands were the Beatles, the Stones, the Animals, the Kinks, the Who, Small Faces, the Yardbirds. They're probably my big bands. What these all had in common was that they all had a sort of art school background to them somewhere. These were all kids who were a bit like the beat writers, the Kerouac and Ginsberg and William Burroughs. Mm-hmm. And by the time I got to 13 years old, my middle brother had discovered a guy called Bob Dylan, right? And I thought, this is unlike anything I'd ever heard. I knew it was good because my parents hated it so much. You know, I knew this guy was onto something. And I've always been political, and I was hearing these songs, and it was my first real exposure to protest music. This early Dylan stuff, The Times Are Changing, and the Blowing in the Wind, Masters of War, Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall, all that stuff was like, wow, that blew me away. When you think at that time, the Beatles were writing I Want to Hold Your Hand, you know, so that was the difference. So I got this stuff. I took this record into school when I was 13,
By the way,
14.
Richard, just to interrupt you, it's funny you mentioned the Beatles because when they discovered Bob Dylan, to your point, their lyrics began to change dramatically. So
Absolutely.
carry on. I just wanted to point that
absolutely. I mean, this is the incredible, the influence effect, isn't it? I mean, so I took this record into school, Times Are Changed, and an English teacher, very switched on guy, looked at that and he identified something in me that had a curiosity about words. So he said, if you like this record, you might like Allen Ginsberg, you might like William Burroughs, you might like Jack Kerouac, you might like Dylan Thomas, you might like William Blake, you might even like, don't say it, Shakespeare. And he just switched on a light for me, this guy. And I went and looked at Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac. And they were like the Holy Trinity for me. I really got them. And it was a time that I was getting into contemporary art as well. And the contemporary art of that time was Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, you know, all the pop painters. And in the UK, it was Francis Bacon and David Hockney and Peter Blake and people like that. So I had these two interests. I had interest in the words and in the pictures, but I didn't have a lot of interest in the music at this time. As I say, no one in my house was musical. There were no instruments. But because it was the 1960s, by the late 60s, 1968, 1969, I wanted to go to university. My dad said, no one in our family has ever been to university. Why should you? So I thought, rather immaturely, but fortuitously, what can I do that will really piss him off? I thought, I'm going to buy a guitar. So that's what I did. I went to Copenhagen with my brother, and I was in a coffee shop, and someone was selling an acoustic guitar, 11 guitar. I bought it for about $30 or whatever. And for the next 3 years, it was my constant companion, you know, trying to work out these things called chords. By the early 70s, I'd sort of got a rudimentary idea, and I'd got enough confidence by about 1973 to start playing with other people, because I knew I wasn't a solo artist at that time, or I wasn't a folk singer, you know. I needed a noise behind me. And the model for my noise that I could hear in my head was the Velvet Underground.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That was the model. 1967, when that first album came out, it brought together really important strands for me. It brought together Andy Warhol, because he discovered them. Lou Reed, who was an English student at Columbus University, I think. And this idea of the avant-garde music, of music that was really pushing the boundaries of using feedback and repetition and just pure noise. And so they were the archetypal art school band, I guess, art rock, you know, as it became known. And what I loved about that, they weren't singing about the moon in June and Baby I Love You. They were singing about heroin, about Venus in Furs, about waiting for the man, about, you know, all this crazy stuff, which obviously as a 16, 17, 18-year-old was the sort of stuff I was interested in. Moon in June, that was from my parents, you know, Perry Como or Frank Sinatra. I wanted something that I could relate to. And so the Velvet Underground sort of crystallized all my interest: poetry, music, the avant-garde, and contemporary art. And you know what? They were cool because they wore shades indoors as well.
Yes. So I'm curious, since you mentioned Bob Dylan and Reed and some of the avant-garde stuff,
yeah,
were you someone that was attracted or a fan of Ian Hunter by any chance, who was kind of a British?
Absolutely. I mean, when my band Doctors of Madness started, 1974, 1975, we got discovered, as they say. Just to put us into a sort of music historical context, prog rock had happened, progressive rock had happened, and psychedelia had happened, and David Bowie and Roxy music had happened, but punk rock hadn't happened. And so we're in this weird sort of black hole in rock music, and there's only 2 or 3 bands even remotely like us, which is Mott the Hoople and Steve Harley, Cockney Rebel, right?
Yeah.
Who were, and why were we similar? Because we were all very influenced by Bowie and Roxy music and the Velvet Underground, I guess. So, those 2 bands I thought of as sort of fellow travelers, if you like. I felt a certain affinity with them, a certain competition with them, to be honest. But they were both older. They'd both been going for a couple of years by the time I signed my first record contract. So, they were out there. But I had something slightly different in mind. They both came from, Mott the Hoople especially, came from a fairly conventional rock and roll background. They wanted to play rock music. I wanted to do that, but I wanted a show. I wanted almost like a caricature band. I had blue hair. I was Kid Strange. My drummer was Peter Dilemma. My fiddle player was Urban Blitz. 1974. No one was doing that.
So that leads to my next question I want to ask you. Forgive me for interrupting, but I have
go.
questions I want to ask you. So suddenly you form this band and there's a fiddle player involved.
Yeah.
Now in the year 2021, that's not that strange, pardon the pun.
Right.
But in the early 1970s, a rock band or a punk band with a fiddle player is something unheard of and really highly unusual. So was that a conscious thing that happened?
It was because I knew I wanted a big sound on these songs, but it's almost orchestral sound. But of course, with 4 people, you're not going to get an orchestral sound. But I thought if I can find the right violin player who can, firstly, it's got to be an electric violin. It can't just be a sweet gypsy thing.
Right.
It's got to go through pedals that could mutate the sound and so on. And in Urban Blitz, I found this guy, and he was a great player as well. So once we found him, the bass player, the drummer, and myself, and we sat down and we started working these songs around this instrumental color of an electric violin. Our way forward became much clearer. And the songs were sometimes very short. They were sometimes very long. They were sometimes very complex. Sometimes they were just 2 chords. So it was hard to pigeonhole exactly what the music was. As I say, I've never been a great musician. I put my hands up to that. And I always wrote within my capabilities, but I wrote songs like not many other people did. I used chords that you shouldn't use together because they were the chords I knew, right? rather than the ones that, a music theorist would say, yeah, you can use that, and that, but you can't use that. I just used it because it was one of the chords I could play.
So one of the questions I have is when you listen to the first Doctors of Madness album, you hear, I hear musicians that are, and this is not a pejorative, but like I hear musicians that they sound experienced to me in relation to the fact that it's basically your first time in a studio for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, it was.
What was that feeling like of being in a studio and sitting at the control board? And like, did you have someone there to guide you?
Let me take you back a little bit before that. So here we are, we're a band, and we're experiencing all the problems that a brand new band has and had back then. So we don't have a manager, we don't have an agent, we don't have a record company. we don't have a van to drive the equipment in. We're arriving on public transport, right?
Taking
And
the
we
tube.
don't have anyone. Yeah, there you go. We don't have anyone getting us gigs. So I've always been a fairly fearless, proactive sort of person. So I think if no one's getting me gigs, I'll get them myself. You know, it's okay. Don't worry. So I found a pub in Twickenham, which is just outside London, and they had a big room upstairs that they'd had bands playing before, but they stopped it. No one was coming. So I went up there on a Sunday evening. It was open, but there was no one there. And I said to the owner, "Look, what's happening here? Do you have music? Do you not have music?" And he said, "Well, we used to, but it was never very popular, so we stopped doing it." I said, "Could I have that room for the next 4 weeks, for the next 4 Saturdays?" He said, "What are you offering me?" I said, "How many people have you got in here tonight?" 3. I can double that. I can get 6 people in here. Right? I knew I was on safe ground there. So he sort of laughed and said, "Oh, there's nothing to lose, because those places exist by selling drinks. And if there's no one there, they don't sell drinks." So
that's right.
There you go.
Yeah.
So week 1, 20 people came. And this is before the internet, before email. So it was all posters, flyers, word of mouth, phone calls. And we got 20 people there. And we were okay. Next week, 40 people there. Next week, 60, 70 people there. Then we get to our last night, and we think it's back to square one after this, but this has been a blast. We got 120 odd people there going crazy, and we're good that night. We are on it, right?
That's good. That's great.
And so we come off stage, we're elated. The audience is going crazy. We're in this state of euphoria, but also realistic enough to know that next week we don't have a gig and we're back to square one. There's the knock on the door. Guy comes in. In fact, his cigar comes in before he does. It's a cigar logo. Okay. And he says, "That was all right." I said, "Thank you very much." He said, "How serious are you guys about wanting to go professional?" Yes, we said, "Yeah, we're serious, but on the right terms with the right people." He said, "Do you like a band called T-Rex?" I said, "Yeah." Do you like a band called Pink Floyd?" "Yeah, cool." "Do you like anyway, 3 or 4 bands?" He says, "I published them. I made so much money by the time I was 30, I retired from the business. A friend of mine came and saw you last week," he said to me, "and said, if I want to get back into the business, this band, Doctors of Madness, might be interesting to go and watch," right? He said, he was right. You're interested. If you're interested, come and see me on Monday in my office, and we'll do a contract. So that's how it started. We went in on Monday, and on the Monday morning when we woke up, we weren't professional musicians. We were semi-professional musicians. We went to his office, and there on the wall, gold discs by Pink Floyd and T-Rex and all this stuff. And he was the real deal. His name is Brian Morrison. And he brought out the contracts. There's your record contract. There's your management. There's your production. In the end, we signed away about 250% of anything we were ever going to earn. But that night, we were a professional band. And he said, "I'm going to put you into a rehearsal room now for 6 weeks. You're not coming out until we've got a deal for you.
Wow.
You go into this rehearsal room 6 days a week. You work 10 hours a day, and you work out who you are. You write songs. You get them so you can play these songs real good. You think about lighting, about costumes, whatever, movement. Who are you?" After 6 weeks, he started bringing in the biggest names in the music industry. Ahmet Ertegun, Clive Davis came and watched us. And our orders from Brian Morrison was, "You do 3 songs and disappear. I'll talk to these people." Right?
Wow. So just quickly, so when you look out in the audience and you see Clive Davis there, like,
it wasn't
you
even
nervous?
this wasn't even an audience. This was in a rehearsal room with my manager, 2 managers, and Clive Davis.
Wow.
Sitting. he would bring Brian Morrison would bring them in one at a time and play them off against each other in terms of negotiations, right? But to cut a long story short, he brought in Phonogram Records one afternoon. They signed us. We had a 3-album deal. They put us on a package with a band called Bebop Deluxe, who was a guy called Bill Nelson, guitarist, who were bigger band than us. They were with EMI Records, and they'd had chart records and stuff. We went out on the road with them, and we were playing big halls with them. And so we went from doing this tiny pub to 40 people, and within 8 weeks, we were playing big halls, you know, to 2,000 people. So everything's going well. Then we go into the recording studio to make our album, Late Night Movies. By this time, we've become a pretty good band because we've been doing it on the road. We've been, you know, doing these songs over and over. We know exactly what's going to happen. We sit ourselves in the studio with a guy called John Punter, who worked on Roxy Music's first album. And we just sat in a circle and tried to blow each other off the face of the earth. You know? And I remember one thing that we kept saying is, we are building cathedrals of sound. That was the thing, you know, with with the old violin going and that bass of stoners and, you know, a lot of vocals and a lot of guitar stuff. You know, we wanted to build big cinematic music. Yeah.
So when you laid down your vocals in the studio for the first time,
yeah,
was it something that it was very easy for you to do, or did you need someone to coach you to sort of say, you know, we need you to bellow this and we need you to?
I sort of knew how I wanted those songs to sound in my head. And I also knew that no one else could do it except me, because I'd written them and I knew what the meaning was. I knew why that word was there in that line. Nothing was left, you know, nothing was an accident.
Okay.
And I knew how I wanted these songs interpreted. And I know how great interpreters of songs are not always great singers. You think of Lou Reed, you think of Tom Waits, you think of Bob Dylan. You know, they're not necessarily great singers technically, but they can sell you a lyric.
Yeah.
And that's what I've always loved. So you know, it was daunting, Clinton. It was daunting to be in a studio and for everyone sort of waiting, now that all the backing tracks have gone down, for me to put the vocal on top. And the vocal is what people hear, you know, a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, is it a great vocal album? No, it's not. But is it the right vocal for that album? I guess it is. I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I feel it is, but yeah, I'm biased. So, so we move along. Like the band puts out an album. The album really takes hold with the public. It starts to develop a following. So now, eventually, you end up with you go back into the studio again, and we're in album number 2 of a 3-album deal.
Yeah, so it's 1976. We're in Abbey Road Studios now. We've gone up a notch. I've asked.
Now, what was that like? What was that like when you walk into Abbey Studio, Abbey Road?
Unbelievable. It's like, it's probably the most famous studio in the world. You know, okay, you might talk about the Record Plant or Gold Star in LA, where Phil Spector used to record or something. But you know, Abbey Road is synonymous with recording studios. It's synonymous with one particular album. But I first went into Abbey Road when I was about 17, and I was a big fan of a English folk singer called Roy Harper. And Roy Harper was with EMI Records, and he's another guy who's a huge influence on my songwriting. He was very wordy, he was very political, he was very controversial and all that sort of stuff. And I was still at school, but I'd met Roy at a gig, and he very kindly said, look, we're doing some stuff at Abbey Road if you want to just come in and sit in the back of the control room and listen and have a smoke, you know, then come in. And his engineer then was John Leckie, and John had not done any production, but he was the EMI house engineer, or one of them, at Abbey Road. So when the time came for our second album, and Phonogram were sufficiently satisfied with the sales of the first to think, okay, we go to number 2, and that goes up again. So we went into the studio with John, and as a producer, and John had never produced before, but he went on to produce Bebop Deluxe and the Adverts and the Skids and Simple Minds, and then he did Radiohead and Stone Roses and Muse and all these bands John has produced subsequently. So going in with John was great. He was easy. He wasn't. He was a very approachable guy. He was not dogmatic, or he didn't have a huge, out of control ego saying you're going to make my record, not your record. You know. So that was all great. So 1976, we got this record up, and we're touring, and I get a phone call from my booking agent saying, "Look, I need you to give me a hand. There's a guy in London who's driving me crazy. He manages a band. They've got a bit of a bad reputation. He wants to take them outside of London and get them some experience of just doing live gigs. They're sweet kids, but you know they're a little bit mischievous." So he said, "Would you mind if I put them on with you up in Middlesbrough, up in the northeast of England? They're called the Sex Pistols." Right? Okay. So I said, "Yeah, I'd heard a little bit about them. They'd only done 2 shows, but the music press was getting excited about them and what they sort of represented, or what they thought they represented." So I said, "Yeah." You know, he said, "Oh God, there's no other band in Britain who would have the Sex Pistols on with them apart from Dr. Madders. You're the first person I came to. There was no second person on the list I was going to ask, you know." So I said, "That's fine." So
hold on a moment. So when you're out with the Sex Pistols, these are one of the questions I've often wondered. Because you've released the first album, and the album has kind of taken off, and it's sort of developed a following. Did you ever feel that some of the other, what became punk rock, like, did you ever have the feeling that some of these bands kind of used your first album as I know they did. I mean, I've spoken to so many of them subsequently, whether it's Dave Vanian from The Damned. I was his best man at his wedding. Joy Division used to support us. The Skids, the Simple Minds used to support us. In the West Country, the Adverts supported us. In the Northeast, the Penetration supported us. All these bands were fans, and not just band members, but I've subsequently met actors and comedians and writers. They all say, you know, you were the big act for me. There was no one like you, you know. But then what happened? We're playing to 600, 800, 1,000 people a night as headliners, and we've got the Pistols on our bill, and I think, I'm just going to watch them. I don't know what all the fuss is about, but I'm just going to watch them from the side. And so the doors open, the fans come in. It was a standing venue. All the fans come down the front. And normally, there's not much interest in a support band, you know. So I'm a bit interested about this. And I'm noticing some of the kids have got a safety pin through their cheek, or a torn T-shirt, or you know, or really short hair, you know. And I'm thinking, there's something happening here. And I watched the Pistols do their sound check, and I didn't get it, but I watched them in front of their audience, and I knew, for me, life was about to change, because someone had just moved the goalposts about what rock music was. Yeah. And so yeah,
I knew that the old ideas about, you know, you make your first album, your second album, your third album, and you build your following like that, and if you're good, and I had no question that we were good. If you're good, you'll still be here in 20 years' time, and you'll be in Abbey Road taking 6 months to make an album instead of 6 weeks or something. But watching the Pistols, none of the old rules applied. It was not about musicality. It was so much about attitude. It was like in your face negativity, nihilism, anarchy.
They kind of took what the Who did with smashing instruments and that sort of thing, and kind of made it their own kind of thing. Not that I don't really care that someone smashes instruments, but
again, it's an art school thing. That thing that Pete Townsend used to do was lifted pretty much from the teachings of a German artist called Gustav Metzger. And Gustav Metzger proposed the notion that destruction is creation, right? And Metzger was Pete Townsend's lecturer, tutor at art school.
Sometimes that's referred to as creative destruction.
Yeah, there you are. Making something out of nothing and making nothing out of something. One thing that couldn't be denied with the Who was you'd never seen anything like this before. Keith Moon tipping his drums over, Pete Townsend literally destroying the guitar and an amplifier every night, and Daltrey with his microphone going around his head. The lasso. It was a danger zone, but it was, oh God, it was exciting. And those great songs that Pete had, Can't Explain, Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere, My Generation,
So by the time the tour ends for the second album, you're getting ready to go back in the studio. Mm-hmm. You're getting ready to do what everyone is hoping is going to be that third big album that's going to really kind of skyrocket you to the top.
But what's happened? The world has changed because record companies now only want punk rock. Yes. In that period between 1976, when we released that, and our next album, 1978, punk rock was the only game in town. From the originals like the Pistols and the Clash and Susie and the Banshees and the Buzzcocks, then you had this whole second wave of the Jam or adverts.
Generation X.
Yeah, Generation X, all this sort of stuff. And then we had all this stuff coming over from America. Richard Hell, the Ramones, Talking Heads, Blondie, Patti Smith, all that sort of stuff coming into the mix. And, the fact that I was 25 years old, these kids were 21. And that's a generation. That's a generation in music. Yeah.
So were you worried going into the studio?
Oh, worried. I knew I was over. I was finished. Wow. I knew that. Even going in to do the third album, I knew that was going to be our last album. I knew there was no record company support anymore. Everyone had sort of, bye. I'm just going to see the Jam tonight, or Susie and the Banshees, or any of those punk bands. And as I say, a generation in music is 3 or 4 years, and the next generation want their own music. And if what you've been doing is big cathedrals of sound that's quite complex lyrically and stuff, and it demands a certain amount of attention and a certain understanding of what the references are that I've written about. God, so much easier if someone says, "White riot, I want a riot," or anarchy in the UK, meaningless stuff. God save the Queen, slogans. Great songs, don't get me wrong. I mean, fantastic.
With catchy slogans, but slogans nonetheless. But they're slogans nonetheless.
Absolutely. But there you go. But, maybe they saw it coming better, because that's not the way my heroes wrote. You know, there's not Lou Reed or Bob Dylan or Tom Waits or Joni Mitchell or whoever. They didn't write songs like that.
To be fair, though, Richard, I mean, you also, I would argue, wrote one of the greatest punk rock songs of all time, which crosses music genres, and that's "Sons of Survival." So, just tell me a little bit about the recording of "Sons of Survival."
I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of that song. I'm really glad you like it. It was an idea about looking at this cross-generational thing and writing a lyric that really expressed my frustration with the music business, but not with art, not with music. My frustration was with the music business, and learning that hard lesson that, you know what, it's not fair. It's not a case of doing something first or being there longest that gets you the most celebrity or success. One of the things I've enjoyed most in my life is the number of people who 40 years later come up and say, your band changed my life, 40 years ago. I often wish that there were not that you could turn the clock back, but that those records that we put out back then could be heard in the context of those times, rather than being looked back on as almost art historical pieces where you approach it almost and you put your gloves on, because these things are so precious. Sons of Survival, let me just get that lyric up and talk about it.
So while you're looking that up, did you know once you would finish the song in the studio and you heard it, the playback of the final mix, and did you know at that moment that you had written something unique and special, or is that something that you learned over time?
No, I knew that was special because the relentlessness of that violin sort of gave it its pulse. It was just it was almost like a metronome. Okay, and those lyrics: here where the losers wear medals and nightshirts and talk revolution but can never let go, watch executions in stereo technico, teach elocution but can never say no. When I'd written that verse, I knew I was onto a winner here, and I could hear this there we go. That, and I think, that's a great opening to a song. It's simple, but it's not. It doesn't go where you want, because it goes.
It changes direction in a way that you don't expect.
It changes direction.
When you hear the intro.
Yeah, and then when I say I'm disenchanted with this trash on the streets of London's old future, this is punk rock. There's dust on the dreams of what might have been. These are probably my dreams I'm talking about. Pinchered by New York and someone's bad childhood, and between next year's Elvis and last year's James Dean. This thing about fashion, this thing about you're either hot or you're not. It never really meant much to me. Am I hot? Am I not? I just want to make good work all the time, and if we had an audience, fantastic. And then the choruses, sometimes it seems you've walked right out on your children, you left them to ride on the crest of the tide that you've drowned in. This is talking to record companies about punk rock. You've let us go as if we were bad smell in the office. Suddenly we're the illegitimate sons of survival. And then it goes on. The next verse references the first album. I told you before, religion's just a fetish, but that's not quite right. It's more of a disease, And then this thing about, we heard about the blacks and what they did to our white women. We heard about the missionaries who taught them all they knew. it's our bad behavior that's been exported around the world, and we call it colonialism. You know, we call it the British Empire. And again, with the band, we know how it feels to be stuck on someone's outside when the inside just isn't into you. When, you know, we were Flavor of the Week with Phonogram Records when we signed, a year and a half down the line, because the music press is talking about punk rock, and so I'm like, oh, hi, Richard, I can't talk now. You know, we got to go.
So
what can you do?
So the third album comes out, and then a decision is made where the band parts ways.
Yeah.
So can you just sort of quickly describe kind of, was it a mutual decision? Was it one that that it wasn't intended to be a permanent or?
No, there was something inevitable about it, because we'd made our 3 albums. So the record company had no compulsion to extend the contract. So after that 3rd album, we were effectively out of contract already. We were a band who'd been around just a bit too long by then, 3 years, 4 years, and who hadn't sold platinum records, that people thought, we could get a punk band for, you know, 1/10 of the money that we'd have to pay to get Doctors of Madness to sign, and they'll probably sell more records in the short term. So I was resigned to it. I thought, that's it. That's my little taste of pop stardom. But
so the band is broken up. So at this point, there's this, and here you are on the unofficial Def Leppard Rock of Ages podcast. So at the moment that, which is kind of ironic in a sense. So at the moment that the Doctors of Madness are moving on to their separate ways, there's this other British band from the north of England in Sheffield called Def Leppard.
Yeah.
So were you aware of the bands?
I was aware of them. I hadn't seen them, and I hadn't met any of them. But through mutual friends in the north of England, in Sheffield, I'd been told that Joe Elliott and I think all the guys used to come to our gigs when we played little clubs in Sheffield, before they were even, you know, a band playing the same clubs, let alone big stadiums. They came along. Joe always loved Mott the Hoople and Ian Hunter, as you know. Joe was a big Bowie fan. Joe was a Roxy Music fan.
Joe and I, just for the record,
yeah.
Joe and I have talked about Doctors of Madness a lot via email over the years. So.
Oh, really? Oh, that's sweet. I mean, I was aware of him. He was obviously aware of us. And it wasn't until much, much later that our paths actually crossed. We actually met and found that we got on really, really well. By that time, he was a big rock star, but always the loveliest, most modest, kind, generous guy.
So this leads to my next question. So as a guy that's growing up in Canada, where the Doctors of Madness just were not able to tour for various reasons, you know, I discovered you guys in part through Joe Elliott. So as a fan of Def Leppard as a kid growing up, I would hear him on occasion mention this great British punk band, the Doctors of Madness. And so here I was thinking, like, okay, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones. I'm like, who are the Doctors of Madness? So we used to have a thing in Canada called Cargo Records. So Cargo Records was an import business where you could import albums from around the world into Canada. And they had this massive catalog. You know, for me, it was my Bible, basically. It was this giant music book of every international release one could think of. And so I started buying Doctors of Madness albums because of Joe talking about you guys. So was there a moment when Def Leppard became this sort of international kind of iconic band? There must have been a point in the 80s or even the early 90s where you started to realize that there were people like me who weren't in any way connected to the UK in the 1970s that had found your band because of Joe.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
was there a moment where you realized that you were developing kind of a fan base in a way through Joe and his love of your band?
Well, what happened was in 1980, I did a solo tour of North America, US, and Canada. And I remember we did Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal and, you know, a few other Canadian towns, mainly in the States, but we came over, and I always got a good reception in Canada. People were always very kind to me, and I started hearing about this more in North America than I did in the UK. That because I think Def Leppard were probably bigger in America than they were in the UK at that point. And then, as I say, mutual friends of the band and myself would say, you know, Joe's favorite Doctors track, it's out. I said, oh, great. I hope they record it one day. You know, and then I can't remember exactly how, but Joe and I met, and we really got on extremely well. And I started, you know, Mutual Admiration Society. I started following their music, you know, and I was watching something over the weekend. And, you know, they're just a brilliant band. But when we were doing this most recent album, Dark Times, this was quite interesting. The Doctors disappeared from 1978 until 2018. I was in hospital. I was rather unwell. And I started thinking, I haven't really made the Doctors album that I'd like to be remembered by. And so I was in hospital and I started writing songs furiously. And there's a lot to write about then, because we had Brexit and we had Trump and we had the whole world situation as source material. And it was dark times. So when I came out of hospital, I came home and I started to make demos of these songs, playing guitars and using drum machines and stuff. Oh, sorry, just in that interim period, something very, very amusing and influential on my life happened. Around about 1988 or something, I got a call from a Japanese record company saying we would like to release all Doctors of Madness back catalogue on CD, and it had never come out on CD before. I said, yeah, okay, that's great, fantastic. So I sent them the master tapes and so on. Then they phoned up and said, would you tour Japan? And we'd never toured Japan. And I said, look, I haven't seen the other guys now for 30 years. You know, no. I'll come and I'll do those songs, but it's too much going back for me to try and put that band together. They'd all gone on and done their own lives. None of them were in music anymore. So they said, okay, that's fine. You'll come. And I said, I'll bring a friend of mine who's a multi-instrumentalist. We'll do different versions of those songs. It'll be fine. Great. So we're going to do that. And then about 10 days before we flew to Japan, I got a call from him again saying, good news, I found a Doctors of Madness tribute band in Tokyo.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually.
I said, I don't even want to hear them. I'm coming. It's perfect. You know? So we went over and we met them at the airport, and they didn't speak hardly any English. I don't speak any Japanese, but they arranged a 3-day rehearsal before the first show. And I went over with my friends, so I had that as an insurance policy. And we went into the studio and we said, okay, Marie and Joe? And they said, oh, Marie and Joe, hi, right? So I'm thinking to myself, Okay, Marie and Joe, if I can, if I play the first 16 bars and they come in on bar 17, we're in business. Oh, sorry, I'm not in this. And they're in by now and they're sounding good. And then they go. And I'm looking at my friend David, I think we're okay. And then breathe, turn and Joe, and they're in, and they're rocking. And so
Were
this.
you surprised at how tight you were as a unit, knowing that you just met them?
I was absolutely astonished. And it didn't matter what song I said, they knew it, and they knew it better than I did. Right? And at that point, there were three of them. There's bass player, drummer, and guitarist. Didn't matter what song I called, Network, Mainlines, Waiting, Sons of Survival, Hi, ba 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 ba. So, and they were brilliant, and I've played with them ever since. They're my go-to band now. So just to come back up to date now, when I was writing these new songs, came out of hospital, started demoing them, and I sent them to John Leckie, who by now had done Radiohead and Muse and Stone Roses, all these bands.
He was now the John Leckie now.
He was now the John Leckie, yeah. And I said, John, I know you're going to be busy. Take as long as you need, but I'm too close to these songs, John. Just listen to them and tell me if I'm wasting my time. And he got back to me the next day and said, we've got to make this record. He said, we've got to make this record. So what happened was, of course, he said, have we got any money? I said, no, of course we haven't got any money. You know? I said, I can maybe get £5,000 together or something. He said, okay, we'll go into a residential studio. We'll work 16 hours a day. You bring your two Japanese musicians over, bass and drums. Stepdaughter is a singer, Lily Budd, and she came in with me to do backing vocals. And within a really quick week, we'd got all 8 tracks down in basic form. Then I got a call from someone called Joe Elliott, right? and Joe says, hey, what's this I heard about a new Doctors of Madness album? I said, yeah, man, Dark Times are doing. He said, I want to be your backing vocalist. So I said, oh, man, that is so kind of you. He said, no, I mean it. You know, your band meant so much to us. I want to be on a Doctors of Madness album. And I've waited 40 years, he said. So I sent him the tracks that I thought he could work on. He'd just come back from the States, actually. He said, look, rather than coming over to London, send me the tracks. I'll do them in Dublin, where I live in my studio. And you just tell me, you just give me feedback on my performances as we're doing them. We do it like that. And that's what we did. And of course, he was brilliant. He's got the fantastic ear for harmony. And he was backing vocalist on 5 out of the 8 songs, I think, or 6 out of the 8 songs. So, and then I said to him, I need someone to play ridiculous glam rock heavy metal guitar for me. And he said, I'll see if Phil can do it. And Phil was away on holiday with his family, I think. And then he got a guy called Paul Guerin from the Choir Boys, who's in Joe's other band, who's in
the Down and Outs.
The Down and Outs, exactly. And he said, I'll get Paul to do it. And he did, and on Sour Hour. And it was brilliant. Yeah.
So one of the questions I wanted to ask you, so Dark Times comes out, and the world has literally changed from the moment that you were last in the studio as a Doctor of Madness. So at that time, everything was physical. It was records, it was cassettes, it was 45s. Yeah. Now you're like Spotify, Apple Music, you know, all of these digital formats.
Yeah.
Was that something that you were familiar with and that you had been following? I was
familiar with it I was familiar with it as a consumer, not as a creator. And And I'd also got familiar with it because I teach music students as well. And of course, whenever I say, right, you've got a great song here, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to put it out there? And this is one of the interesting things about the music business in the way it's changed in a digital world. What it's done is it's made the process of making music to a high quality much more accessible. Everyone has got GarageBand or Logic or Pro Tools on their computer now, yeah? And every band got 4 members. You can put $50 each in and get Logic Pro 10, you know, or whatever, yeah? So everyone's now got the potential to have the same quality of recording as I had in Abbey Road in 1976, probably better with all the plugins, the reverbs, the delays, the modulators, the compressors, the limiters, all that sort of stuff.
And they can do it all in something the size of their phone.
They could do it all in something the size of their phone. The problem is always, though, now, not the making of the music, but getting it heard, because there's such a proliferation of music now. Because it's so accessible, it's so democratized, that process of making great sounding masters. You've still got to get it heard above all the other bands who are making great masters. And without the record companies coming in and pushing you, it's a really hard slog. You know, it's really hard because how do you get yourself? Record companies now have become so timid and safe. They only want to sign bands that have got 5 million YouTube followers or YouTube hits, you know, or 5 million Instagram followers. You know, they don't want to take a band now and say, we'll develop this act over 3 albums over 4 years or something. They haven't got time, and they don't feel they need to. They could make a quick buck.
So just to change the timeline a little bit, so the first time that we started to communicate was about 6 years ago. I'd started to travel to the UK for work.
Yeah.
And I found out that you were doing tours of London, like you had a customized tour. So is that something you're still doing? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about that? And
yeah, I'd like to have I like doing a solo show that is based around this memoir that I wrote back in the turn of the millennium. And this, when I got to 50 years old, someone asked me to write about that 50 years. They thought it was a good story, you know, going through, because in that interim, I'd gone from being a musician to being an actor to working in Batman and in Gangs of New York and in Harry Potter and in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And I'd got a career as an actor working in that stuff. I was also running club nights and putting on gigs and so on. So I've always had a curiosity about stuff outside of music. I've always been interested in it. So when I wrote this memoir, which is now an audiobook, it's something I've done in the lockdown, is turn this into an audiobook. It seemed like a good source material or a good skeleton on which to put a live show together. So to go out with an acoustic guitar, reading some stories and anecdotes and memories and experiences from the book, whether it's Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren, whether it's working with Martin Scorsese or with Jack Nicholson on Batman or whatever, and singing maybe 10 songs, 15 songs, taking requests, doing a question and answer. What was it like working with so-and-so? What do you remember about the Sex Pistols? You know, whatever it is. And that show is good for me because it's transportable. It all goes in the car. It's a guitar, it's a projector, it's a laptop, and there's a lot of t-shirts, you know, which is the only way we get paid now, you know, selling the t-shirt.
So we gotta find a way to get to get you touring in Canada.
Oh man, I'm there in a heartbeat. I love touring. I love being with an audience in any format. You know, whether I'm with Doctors of Madness, and I do. I was supposed to tour Japan, Finland, Holland, and Sweden with Doctors last year, but of course the pandemic put an end to that. But I play with my Japanese friends in Japan. I tour Japan every year with Doctors of Madness, and I love it. I love it.
So so the final question I have, it's not music, it's just about life in general. So you mentioned COVID and how that's kind of changed the world here in the last 2 years. So how are you how are you coping as far as you know, the social distancing and not being able to do your day-to-day?
That hurts, and I think that hurts. It's I think the thing I miss most of all is live music. I'm a big live music fan at every level, at club level, at student level, and at festival and stadium level. I love live music. It's in me, and it still excites me. But I'm also a realist. I know if no one's going to be doing that for a year or 2 years, and we didn't know when things started that it would be closer to 2 years than 2 months or something that we were locked down. I'm too restless to just think this isn't fair or that's bad luck. I think I've got to do something else. So I did an audio book of the memoir, and that's available now. I did I do a weekly radio show now, a 2-hour show called Dark Times Radio, which is it features music that I've made, music that I've collaborated on.
By the way, I listened to it.
Thank you. And now that's been taken up by a station in LA. It's been taken up by 2 radio stations in London. It's one in Yorkshire, one in Portugal, another in Japan is picking it up. So, you know, again, I have to keep busy. I go mad if I'm not busy. I teach students. I teach masters contemporary music students with another Sheffield pop star called Martin Ware, who's my buddy. And Martin was with the Human League and Heaven 17. And he and I run this course together at a higher education establishment called Tile Yard Education. And we talk about record production, about songwriting, about live work, about working for, or making music for things outside of rock and roll, for TV, for film, for fine art installations, for commercials, for contemporary dance, for, you know, theater, whatever it is. So you just have to, you have to keep working, you have to keep busy, you have to keep thinking, otherwise you die.
Well, I want to thank you for giving me your time. I know you're extremely
It's been
busy.
a real pleasure, Clinton, and thank you for your excellent research. You know, nothing's easier or more fun than chatting to someone who knows your work and wants to know a little bit more about it. So thank you for being so well prepared.
Well, I have one final request. I have a friend of mine. His name is Warren Kinsella.
Yeah.
And he lives in the Greater Toronto area.
Yeah.
And he is a Doctors of Madness fan. I'd love for you to give him a shout out.
Hey, Warren Kinsella, I can't wait to come over and get this guitar out, man. I'm going to play you any song you want. I promise you, any song you want. We'll start with. Tony wants to give me a shotgun. He sometimes wants to take my place. But Billy wants to give up his Russian. Well, that's written in the rouge on his face. Come and see me in Toronto. I'll be there, I promise you.
Excellent. Well, Richard, thank you very much for your time. I would encourage everybody to follow Richard on Twitter. He's very prolific on Twitter. Also follow the Doctors of Madness. You can find them on the social media channels. So it's @StrangeRichard. and at Madness Doctors. And if you do that, you can find them on social media and Twitter and Instagram and all of those channels. So, Richard, thank you very much.
And the book, the audio book, you can download that. You pay what you want for the audio book, and it's got every story I've ever told and many more. You find that on richardstrange.bandcamp.com.
Thank you very much, Richard. We will do this another time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Strange. Punks and Drunks and Flicks and Kicks. Written and read by Richard Strange. Chapter 1. The 50s and 60s. While there was no cast-iron genetic inevitability that I should end up scratching a living from words and music, two names in my ancestry may have rattled a heavy hint down the hereditary chain to indicate the road my life might take.
Condoms off.
There was a time in my life as a rock and roll disc jockey, I was playing your songs every third song. You might have been the biggest band in the world at one point. Am I correct?
Why can't a rock group sell records to an Elton John fan or a Michael Jackson fan or whatever without losing your original market? It's just good rock music that we'd like to appeal to everybody.
The mountains of Holland, as Joe said.
Probably the best audience of this tour. And I got this Led Zeppelin t-shirt at Taz Records, yeah.
Fantastic.
There's a little local record store, so that means I'm local.
Bowling and just the hair and the image, and it was, you know, he really was, in my eyes, the grandfather of the glam rock movement.
If Mutt's listening, I'm sorry for giving you a mouthful.
I was actually born 5 minutes walk from here.
I've got a theory.
Yeah.
Just give half of what you have to somebody you don't like.